The bright lights of the studio beamed down as John Miller adjusted his tie one last time. Tonight was no ordinary night for the veteran talk show host. After months of persistent requests and careful negotiation, he had secured what many in the industry considered impossible, an in-person interview with Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor and director rarely made television appearances these days, making this a truly special event. 2 minutes till we're live, called out a voice from the control room. The studio audience buzzed with excitement. Some had lined up since dawn to secure seats, while others had won tickets through radio contests. They represented a mix of devoted fans who had followed Eastwood's career for decades and younger admirers who appreciated his more recent directorial work. Susan Bennett, the show's producer, paced nervously behind the cameras. This interview could potentially be the highest-rated segment of the year. She had worked with John for 15 years, but she had never seen him this focused before a show. Eastwood's latest historical drama was already generating Oscar buzz, and getting him to open up about his creative process would be a major coup for their network. "He's here," whispered Greg Thompson, John's assistant, pointing discreetly toward the side entrance. The room fell silent as Clint Eastwood walked onto the set. Even at his advanced age, he commanded attention without effort. His tall frame moved with purpose, and his eyes, still sharp and observant, scanned the studio briefly before he nodded at John with a slight smile. He wore a simple dark blue suit, with no tie, his signature casual yet dignified style. "Mr. Eastwood, thank you for joining us," John said, extending his hand as cameras captured their meeting. "Call me Clint," Eastwood replied, his voice carrying that familiar rasp that had become as iconic as his squint. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Eastwood took his seat. Several people pulled out their phones, hoping to capture a moment of the rare appearance despite the no-recording policy that had been announced multiple times. 10 seconds, called the floor director, and the red light on the main camera blinked on. John's introduction was smooth and respectful, highlighting Eastwood's 60-year career without dwelling too long on the past. The first 10 minutes of the interview covered expected territory, the challenges of directing at his age, his approach to storytelling, and how the film industry had changed over his lifetime. The audience seemed satisfied but not particularly surprised by any of the conversation. This was typical Eastwood, thoughtful, a bit reserved, occasionally humorous in a dry way, but mostly focused on the craft rather than himself. Then John shifted the conversation. "Your new film touches on themes of reconciliation and finding common ground in divided times. Do you think current global events influenced your approach to this story?" Eastwood paused, considering the question. The studio grew quieter, the kind of silence that falls when people sense something meaningful might be shared. I've never been one to mix movies with politics or religion openly," Eastwood began, his voice measured. "But I do believe artists respond to the world around them, whether they intend to or not." He shifted slightly in his chair, leaning forward. "I've been particularly interested in what Pope Robert Prevost has been saying lately about healing. Divisions. Not just religious divisions, but cultural ones. He talked about how art can bridge gaps when politics fail." The mention of the Pope's name sent a visible ripple through the audience. Susan, watching from the production area, felt her heartbeat quicken. This was unexpected territory. Eastwood rarely discussed religion, and certainly not specific religious figures. "Pope Prevost suggested that we're losing the ability to listen to each other," Eastwood continued, seemingly unaware of the stir he was creating. "And that resonated with me. The character in my film is struggling with that same challenge, how to hear what others are truly saying beyond their words." John Miller, ever the professional, managed to hide his surprise, though his mind raced with follow-up questions. The Pope that Eastwood mentioned had only been appointed 8 months earlier, the first American to hold the position in the church's history. His selection had been controversial in some circles, celebrated in others. "That's fascinating," John said, genuinely intrigued. "I wasn't aware you followed Pope Prevost's statements." Eastwood gave a small shrug. "I'm not particularly religious in any organized way. Never have been. But I recognize wisdom when I hear it, regardless of the source." He paused, then added with a hint of his trademark half-smile. Plus, it's not every day an American becomes Pope. Makes you pay attention. A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience. People glanced at each other, trying to gauge reactions. Was Clint Eastwood, the symbol of rugged American individualism, expressing admiration for the Pope? The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Frank Rogers, a longtime Eastwood fan sitting in row 3, later told reporters he nearly dropped his program. "I've followed Clint since the Rawhide days. Never once heard him talk about religion, not once." In the control booth, the director made quick decisions, signaling camera operators to capture audience reactions. Close-ups revealed expressions, ranging from confusion to fascination. One elderly woman in the front row appeared to be nodding vigorously in agreement. "Could you share what specific message from Pope Prevost connected with your film?" John asked, seizing the unexpected moment. Eastwood shifted again, the leather chair creaking slightly. He gave this speech at a university in Madrid. Talked about how art creates spaces where opposing viewpoints can coexist without immediate judgment. Said something like, "In great art, we suspend our defenses and allow ourselves to see through others' eyes." That's essentially what my film tries to do. Social media was already exploding. Backstage, Greg Thompson showed Susan his phone screen where Eastwood and Pope were trending. Media outlets were picking up the live feed, cutting into their regular programming to broadcast the unexpected. Turn in the interview. The Pope also mentioned film specifically, Eastwood continued. Said cinema has a unique power because it combines so many art forms, visual, musical, literary. Called it a complete language of human experience. I've been making movies for 60 years and I couldn't have said it better myself. The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. This was not the Clint Eastwood they had expected, not the tough guy from the Westerns, nor the gruff director known for sparse comments and letting his work speak for itself. John sensed the moment's significance and decided to press gently further. "Have you ever had the opportunity to meet Pope Prevost?" A flicker of something, memory perhaps, crossed Eastwood's face. "Actually, yes. Years ago, before he became Pope. He was still Cardinal Prevost then. We met briefly at a film festival in Rome where I was receiving an award. He was representing the Vatican's cultural office or something similar." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Susan signaled frantically to the commercial break coordinator to delay the scheduled break. This was television gold. "He wasn't what I expected," Eastwood continued. "No preaching, no judgment. Just genuine interest in how films affect people. We talked about Westerns, actually." He allowed himself a rare, full smile. Turns out the Pope, well, future Pope, was a fan of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Said something about moral complexity that stuck with me. The audience finally broke, their stunned silence. A wave of surprised laughter and applause spreading through the studio. The incongruity of the Pope enjoying spaghetti westerns struck a chord of delighted disbelief. As the commercial break finally arrived, the buzz in the studio was electric. People turned to their neighbors, discussing what they'd just witnessed. The production team huddled, quickly reshaping the second segment to explore this unexpected connection further. No one had anticipated that Clint Eastwood would create the most memorable moment of the night by mentioning the Pope. But as Susan Bennett watched the audience's animated reactions, she knew this interview would be remembered long after the film being promoted had left theaters. The commercial break gave everyone a chance to catch their breath. The studio buzzed with excitement as makeup artists rushed to touch up both John Miller and Clint Eastwood. Susan Bennett, the show's producer, hurried over to John and whispered something in his ear. He nodded, making quick notes on the small pad he kept beside his chair. Eastwood seemed unfazed by the stir he had created. He sipped water calmly, gazing around the studio with mild interest. Unlike many celebrities who became animated off camera, he maintained the same quiet presence whether the red light was on or off. Patricia Clark, sitting in the front row, couldn't believe her luck. She had won tickets to the show through a radio contest, never expecting to witness such an unusual moment in television history. She turned to her husband beside her. "Did you ever think you'd hear Clint Eastwood talk about the Pope?" she whispered. Her husband shook his head, still looking stunned. Never in a million years. Backstage, Greg Thompson was frantically researching Pope Robert Prevost on his tablet. As John's assistant, he needed to provide the host with any useful information before they went live again. He scribbled notes about the Pope's background, American-born, previously served in Peru, known for his work bridging cultural divides. 30 seconds, called the floor director. The audience settled back into their seats. Phones that had been pulled out during the break to share what they'd just witnessed disappeared into pockets and purses. The red light blinked on, and they were live again. John leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Welcome back. We're here with Clint Eastwood, discussing his new film and some unexpected connections to current events. He turned to his guest. Clint, before the break you mentioned meeting Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Prevost, at a film festival in Rome. Can you tell us more about that encounter? Eastwood shifted in his chair, his expression warming slightly at the memory. It wasn't a planned meeting. The Vatican sends representatives to major cultural events, and he happened to be at a reception after the awards ceremony. Most people there wanted to talk about my films or get photographs. He wanted to talk about the moral questions raised in Unforgiven. A murmur of interest passed through the audience. Unforgiven, Eastwood's 1992 Western, had won him Oscars for Best Picture and Best Director. It was known for its complex exploration of violence and redemption. That surprised me, Eastwood continued. Here was this church official asking thoughtful questions about a pretty violent Western. Not condemning it, mind you, but really examining what it was saying about human nature and forgiveness. John nodded. And what did you discuss about it? He asked me if William Money, my character, found redemption in the end. Said he found it interesting that a man who thought he'd left violence behind could return to it so completely. Eastwood paused. I told him I didn't think the film answers that question, it asks it. And how did he respond to that? John asked. He liked that answer. Eastwood allowed himself a small smile. Said too many people want easy moral lessons, when real life doesn't work that way. That good art raises questions rather than dictating answers. He shook his head slightly. Never expected that kind of conversation from a cardinal. Nancy White, the social media analyst working for the network, watched the trending topics explode on her monitor. Eastwood and Pope had now reached #1 nationally. Video clips from the first segment were already being shared widely, with viewers expressing amazement at this unexpected side of the Hollywood legend. Did you stay in touch after that meeting? John asked. No, Eastwood replied. It was just one conversation at one event. But when he was named Pope last year, I remembered it. Thought it was interesting that someone with that perspective on art and moral complexity would reach that position. In the audience, Frank Rogers leaned forward in his seat. He had been a fan of Eastwood since the Rawhide days, following his evolution from TV cowboy to international film star to acclaimed director. Never once had he heard Eastwood speak about religious figures with such obvious respect. You mentioned earlier that some of Pope Prevost's recent statements about art and healing divisions resonated with you, John prompted. How did that influence your new film, if at all? Eastwood considered the question. The studio grew quiet again, everyone waiting for his response. I wouldn't say it directly influenced the film. The script was mostly finished before he became Pope. But his ideas validated something I've believed for a long time, that stories can help us understand perspectives we might otherwise reject. He paused. My new film is about two men on UA, opposite sides of a historical conflict who are forced to work together. Neither one changes their core beliefs, but they learn to see each other as human. And you see a parallel with Pope Prevost's message? John asked. He gave this speech at the UN about 6 months ago. Talked about how we've lost the ability to disagree respectfully. Said we need to create spaces where different viewpoints can exist in the same room without anyone feeling threatened. Eastwood nodded slowly. That's what my film tries to do. Create that kind of space. The audience was completely silent now. Many had come expecting typical promotional talk about filmmaking techniques or funny stories from the set. Instead, they were witnessing something much more meaningful. A glimpse into the philosophical thinking of a cultural icon. Kathy Lewis, a religious correspondent who happened to be watching the broadcast from her home, immediately recognized the significance of what was happening. She picked up her phone and called her editor. "Are you watching the Eastwood interview?" she asked urgently. "This is huge. He's basically endorsing Pope Prevost's interfaith dialogue initiative through his film. We need to cover this." Back in the studio, John decided to explore the connection further. For viewers who might not be familiar with Pope Prevost's statements on art and dialogue, could you summarize what about his message spoke to you? Eastwood nodded. He talked about how art, good art, creates a safe distance that allows us to examine difficult ideas. When we read a novel or watch a film, we temporarily step outside our own perspective. We might see through the eyes of someone we'd normally consider an enemy. His voice grew slightly more animated. Prevost called it rehearsing empathy. I like that phrase. It's what I've tried to do with many of my films, especially as a director. Several audience members nodded in agreement. A young woman in the second row wiped away a tear, visibly moved by the unexpected depth of the conversation. Susan Bennett, watching from the production area, made a quick decision. She signaled to John through his earpiece to continue this line of discussion and delay the planned clip from Eastwood's new film. This conversation was far more compelling than any promotional material they could show. Your films often feature characters with complicated moral codes, John observed. People who don't fit neatly into hero or villain categories. Is that a conscious choice? Always has been, Eastwood replied. Real people don't wear white hats or black hats. We're all capable of both good and terrible things given the right circumstances. Pope Prevost said something similar in his Easter address. That redemption is available to everyone because everyone needs it. He gave a slight shrug. I'm not a religious man in the traditional sense, but that strikes me as true. The cameras panned briefly to capture the audience's reactions. People sat forward in their seats, completely engaged. This was no longer just a celebrity interview. It had become something closer to a philosophical discussion about art, morality, and human nature, connecting one of Hollywood's most iconic figures to the leader of the Catholic Church in unexpected ways. As they approached the next commercial break, John knew this interview would be remembered long after Eastwood's new film had left theaters. Something authentic and unplanned had emerged, the kind of television moment that couldn't be manufactured or predicted. We'll be right back with more from our conversation with Clint Eastwood, John said to the camera, as the red light blinked off. In the momentary darkness before the studio lights came back up, he caught Eastwood's eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement between two professionals that something special was happening. Eastwood returned the nod with the hint of a smile, seemingly content to have surprised everyone, including himself. During the second commercial break, the studio hummed with excited conversation. Audience members who had never spoken to each other before now turned in their seats to share their amazement. The production crew moved with renewed energy, sensing they were part of something historic. Susan Bennett received a call from the network president, who had been watching the broadcast from home. Whatever you do, don't cut this short, he told her. This is the kind of television people will be talking about tomorrow. Greg Thompson handed John Miller a note with additional information about Pope Prevost's artistic initiatives. John read it quickly, formulating his next questions. Meanwhile, Eastwood sat quietly, seemingly at ease despite being the center of this unexpected storm. Linda Foster, Eastwood's longtime publicist, watched from the side of the studio with a mixture of surprise and professional calculation. This was not the promotional interview she had prepared her client for, but the authentic conversation was proving far more impactful than any planned talking points about the new film. When they returned from the break, John decided to shift the focus slightly. Welcome back to our conversation with Clint Eastwood. Clint, I'm curious. Many viewers might be surprised by your interest in Pope Prevost's ideas, given that you've rarely discussed religion publicly. Has spirituality influenced your work in ways that might not be obvious to audiences? Eastwood adjusted his position slightly, taking a moment to consider the question. I've never been comfortable with labels, religious, spiritual, whatever, but I've always been interested in what drives people. What gives their lives meaning? He paused. My films often deal with questions of purpose, redemption, justice. Those are spiritual questions, even if they're not wrapped in religious language. And, do you see Pope Prevost addressing similar questions? John asked. What interests me about him is that he seems to be looking beyond doctrine to the human experience underneath, Eastwood replied. In that speech I mentioned, he talked about how art creates bridges between different worldviews, said something like, great art asks universal questions that transcend our cultural and religious differences. He smiled slightly. I've been trying to do that for 60 years, though I probably wouldn't have put it in those words. In her living room across town, Kathy Lewis, the religious correspondent, was recording every word. She had already drafted the opening of her article. In an unexpected convergence of Hollywood and the Vatican, legendary filmmaker Clint Eastwood revealed a surprising connection to Pope Robert Prevost's vision for art as a tool for dialogue. Back. In the studio, John followed up with a question that many viewers were likely wondering. You mentioned meeting Cardinal Prevost years ago at a film festival. Was there anything else about that meeting that stayed with you? Eastwood's eyes took on a distant look, as if reaching back through decades of memories. We talked about Westerns. Not just mine, but the genre as a whole. He had this theory that Westerns speak to something universal about moral choices made outside the structures of civilization. He chuckled softly. Pretty sophisticated take for someone I expected to condemn them for violence. The audience laughed appreciatively, relaxing into this unusual conversation. He mentioned John Ford's The Searchers. Eastwood continued. Asked me if I thought Ethan Edwards, John Wayne's character, found redemption in the end. He shook, his head slightly. You don't expect that level of film analysis from a cardinal. And what did you tell him? John asked, genuinely curious. I said I thought the character was offered a chance at redemption, but that the film leaves it open whether he fully embraces it. Eastwood's voice grew thoughtful. That's what I've tried to do in my own films. Leave room for the audience to decide, not preach at them. In the control room, the director made a quick decision to show a montage of clips from Eastwood's films that illustrated this point. Morally complex characters from Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, and Gran. Torino making difficult choices. The audience watched, seeing these familiar films in a new light given the context of the conversation. When the clips ended, John asked, do you see a connection between that approach to filmmaking and what Pope Prevost is advocating for in terms of dialogue? I think so, Eastwood nodded. He talks about creating spaces where people can encounter different viewpoints without feeling threatened. Good films do that naturally. You might disagree with what a character does, but if the storytelling is honest, you understand why they did it. He leaned forward slightly. That's becoming rare in public discourse. Everyone wants simple heroes and villains. Peter Collins, a film professor watching the broadcast at a bar with colleagues, nearly spilled his drink in excitement. This is incredible, he told his companions. Eastwood is basically describing an ethical framework for cinema that aligns with Prevost's theology of dialogue. I'm assigning this interview to my students tomorrow. In the studio, audience members nodded in agreement with Eastwood's words. His plain-spoken wisdom seemed to resonate across political and religious lines, even those who might normally dismiss. Religious figures found themselves intrigued by the unexpected connection between the filmmaker and the Pope. Pope Prevost recently established a Vatican film initiative, John noted, referencing the information Greg had provided. A program to support films that promote understanding across cultural and religious boundaries. Would you have any interest in being involved with something like that? Eastwood raised an eyebrow, clearly hearing this information for the first time. I wasn't aware of that program, he said, but it sounds worthwhile. I've always believed film has that power to help us see through eyes not our own. He considered for a moment. I'd need to know more details, but yes, I might be interested. The audience broke into spontaneous applause at this possibility, the iconic filmmaker potentially collaborating with the Vatican on a cultural initiative. It was a scenario no one could have imagined before this interview began. Susan Bennett felt a surge of professional pride. In an era of carefully managed celebrity appearances, this genuine, unscripted conversation felt revolutionary. The show's social media accounts were seeing engagement numbers unlike anything they'd experienced before. Your new film deals with two enemies who gradually develop respect for each other without abandoning their principles, John said. Do you see that as a model for the kind of dialogue Pope Prevost is advocating? I didn't make the film as a political or religious statement, Eastwood cautioned. But yes, that's the heart of the story. Learning to see the humanity in someone you've been taught to hate. He paused. One character says to the other, I still think you're wrong, but I don't think you're evil anymore. That's progress of a sort. The studio grew quiet as people absorbed this simple but profound observation. In a world increasingly divided by harsh rhetoric and demonization of opponents, the idea of separating a person's humanity from their belief struck many as revolutionary. I think that's what Prevost is getting at with his emphasis on dialogue, Eastwood continued. Not that we'll all agree in the end, but that we might see each other as people first, with the same basic hopes and fears. Karen Mitchell, an audience member who had come mainly because her husband was a fan, found herself unexpectedly moved. She had been raised Catholic but had drifted away from the church years ago. Something about hearing Eastwood, not known for religious sentiment, speak respectfully about the Pope's vision made her curious to learn more. As they approached the third commercial break, John realized they had barely mentioned Eastwood's new film directly. Yet somehow, through this unexpected discussion of Pope Prevost and the power of art to bridge divides, they had revealed more about the filmmaker's vision than any standard promotional interview could have achieved. We'll be right back with more from our extraordinary conversation with Clint Eastwood, John said as they cut to commercial. The red light blinked off, but the energy in the studio remained high. Something special was happening. A genuine meeting of minds across the seemingly vast divide between Hollywood and the Vatican, bridged by an aging filmmaker still capable of surprising everyone. By the third commercial break, news of the interview had spread far beyond the show's regular audience. Major news networks had picked up the feed and were broadcasting portions live. Journalists scrambled to write articles about this unexpected, cultural moment. Social media platforms were flooded with clips and quotes from the conversation. In the Vatican, Alan Peters, the communications director, was woken by a phone call despite the late hour in Rome. A staff member informed him about Eastwood's comments regarding Pope Prevost. Peters immediately recognized the significance and began drafting a statement, knowing that by morning, questions would be pouring in from media outlets worldwide. Back in the studio, the production team made quick adjustments to the final segment. The planned movie clip would be shortened to allow more time for conversation. Susan Bennett received word that viewership had doubled since the interview began, with people tuning in after seeing mentions on social media. When the broadcast resumed, John Miller addressed the audience. If you're just joining us, we're having a remarkable conversation with Clint Eastwood about his new film, but also about some unexpected connections to Pope Robert Prevost's vision for art and dialogue. He turned to Eastwood. During the break, I was informed that the Vatican's film initiative you mentioned actually has a name, Bridges of Understanding. It was established just 3 months ago to support filmmakers whose work promotes dialogue across cultural and religious divisions. Eastwood nodded with interest. That's a good name for it. There's already speculation online about whether you might participate in some way, John continued. Would you consider attending an event at the Vatican if invited? The audience leaned forward collectively, awaiting his answer. Eastwood took a moment before responding. I don't do many public appearances these days, he said, his voice measured. But for something meaningful like that? Yes, I might. He smiled slightly. Though, I doubt the Pope remembers our brief conversation from years ago. In her apartment, Kathy Lewis was already on the phone with Vatican sources trying to determine if Pope Prevost had indeed mentioned Eastwood or his films in any recent private conversations. She suspected the Pope would certainly remember the meeting now. given the publicity this interview was generating. Your willingness to discuss these connections has clearly resonated with many viewers, John observed. Our social media team tells me that quotes from this interview are already being widely shared. Why do you think people are responding so strongly? Eastwood considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful. People are hungry for genuine conversation. Not shouting matches, not performances, just authentic exchange of ideas. He gestured slightly with one hand. Maybe they're surprised to hear someone like me talk about a pope with respect. Or maybe they're just glad to hear anyone in public life acknowledge that we need to listen to each other better. In the audience, Patricia Clark felt a lump in her throat. Her brother hadn't spoken to her in 3 years because of political differences. Something about Eastwood's words made her want to reach out to him again. Let's talk about your film directly for a moment, John suggested. You've described it as a story about two enemies who develop respect for each other, without abandoning their principles. Can you tell us a bit more about how that unfolds? It's set during the Civil War, Eastwood explained. A Union officer and a Confederate soldier are trapped together after a battle. Both injured, both unable to escape. At first they're ready to kill each other if they get the chance. But over 3 days they start to recognize each other's humanity. And does either character change his mind about the war? John asked. No, Eastwood shook his head. The Union man still believes slavery is an abomination that must end. The Confederate still believes the federal government has overstepped its authority. Those positions don't change. What changes is how they see each other. The control room director queued up a brief clip from the film, a tense scene showing the two wounded men sharing a canteen, their faces revealing a complex mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. When the clip ended, John asked, "Do you see a parallel between this scenario and Pope Prevost's call for dialogue across religious and cultural divides?" "I think the principle is the same," Eastwood nodded. Prevost talks about creating shared spaces where people with different beliefs can encounter each other as human beings first. In my film, that shared space is created by circumstances. These men are trapped together. But the result is similar. They don't walk away agreeing, but they walk away seeing each other differently. Bill Johnson, a cultural commentator for a major newspaper, was already typing notes for what would become an analysis piece titled The Eastwood Doctrine, Hollywood's Unexpected Alignment with Vatican Diplomacy. He saw profound connections between Eastwood's storytelling philosophy and Prevost's theological approach to dialogue. One thing that strikes me about Pope Prevost, Eastwood continued, is that he seems genuinely interested in reaching beyond his own tradition. He's visited mosques, synagogues, Hindu temples, not to convert anyone but to listen. He smiled slightly. That's rare in any field. Politics, religion, even filmmaking. Most of us prefer to talk rather than listen. The audience murmured in agreement. Many found themselves surprised to be considering the Pope's activities in this new light, filtered through Eastwood's straightforward perspective. Has making this film, with its themes of finding common ground, affected your own views on current divisions in our society? John asked. Eastwood shifted slightly in his chair. I've lived long enough to see many cycles of division and unity in this country. What concerns me now is how quickly we assign bad motives to those we disagree with. He paused. My film suggests another approach, assuming the other person has reasons for their beliefs that make sense to them, even if they don't make sense to you. In homes across the country, viewers found themselves reflecting on their own relationships with family members and friends who held different political or religious views. Eastwood's words, delivered without preaching or judgment, created space for such reflection. Linda Foster, Eastwood's publicist, was already fielding calls from religious organizations and cultural institutions, all wanting to invite Eastwood to speak about these themes. She knew her client well enough to anticipate that he would decline most of these invitations, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But she also sensed that this unexpected conversation about Pope Prevost had touched something genuine in him. As we near the end of our time together, John said, I'm curious, what do you hope audiences will take away from your new film, especially in light of this conversation about dialogue and understanding? I hope they'll see that it's possible, To hold firm to your convictions while still recognizing the humanity of those who disagree, Eastwood replied. That's not weakness, it's strength. It takes more courage to listen than to shout. He smiled slightly. I think Pope Prevost would agree with that. The audience broke into spontaneous applause, many rising to their feet. What had begun as a standard promotional interview had evolved into something much more meaningful, a bridge between seemingly separate worlds, built through one filmmaker's unexpected reflections. Susan Bennett signaled to John that they should extend the interview by a few minutes, postponing the next segment. The network executives had already agreed. This was the kind of authentic television moment that couldn't be planned or manufactured. Before we go, John said, I understand you brought a special clip from the film that hasn't been seen anywhere else. Would you like to set it up for us? Eastwood nodded. This is from late in the film, after the two men have been trapped together for several days. They've just had their most honest conversation yet about why they're fighting on opposite sides. This moment comes afterward. The lights dimmed slightly as the clip began to play. The audience watched in rapt attention, now viewing the film through the lens of this unexpected conversation about Pope Prevost and the power of art to bridge divides. No one in the studio that night, not the host, not the audience members, not even Eastwood himself, had anticipated how a simple mention of the Pope would transform an ordinary interview into an extraordinary cultural moment that would be discussed for weeks to come. The days following the interview brought a wave of responses that surprised even veteran media analysts. Clips of Eastwood discussing Pope Prevost were viewed millions of times online. Newspapers and magazines featured the story on their front pages. Television talk shows devoted segments to analyzing the unexpected connection between the filmmaker and the Pope. 3 days after the broadcast, the Vatican released an official statement. Alan Peters, the communications director, had worked closely with Pope Prevost's staff to craft the carefully worded message, His Holiness. Pope Robert Prevost expresses gratitude for Mr. Eastwood's thoughtful reflections on the role of art in creating dialogue across differences. The Holy Father recalls with warmth their brief meeting years ago at the Rome Film Festival and appreciates Mr. Eastwood's lifelong commitment to exploring moral complexity through cinema. The statement confirmed what many had wondered. Pope Prevost did indeed remember the conversation Eastwood had mentioned. This added another layer of fascination to the story, suggesting a meaningful connection between two influential figures from vastly different worlds. Linda Foster's phone rang constantly with interview requests for Eastwood. True to form, he declined most of them, preferring to let the original conversation stand on its own. He's never been one to milk a moment, Linda explained to disappointed producers. He said what he wanted to say already. Eastwood did, however, agree to one follow-up, a written statement released a week after the interview. I'm surprised by the attention my comments have received. I simply spoke honestly about an encounter and ideas that I found meaningful. If this has contributed in some small way to more thoughtful dialogue about our differences, I'm glad for that. The premiere of Eastwood's film took place 2 weeks later. What would normally have been a standard Hollywood event took on new significance. Religious leaders from various faiths were invited alongside the usual industry figures. Cardinal Joseph Winters, representing the Vatican, attended as a special guest. Though Pope Prevost could not be present, his influence was felt throughout the evening. The film itself was received with enthusiastic reviews. Critics noted the deeper resonance it now carried, given the context of Eastwood's comments about dialogue and understanding. Paul Murphy, a veteran film reviewer, wrote, What might have been seen as simply a well-crafted historical drama now stands as a powerful statement about our current moment. Eastwood has inadvertently provided a masterclass in how art can bridge our deepest divides. At the premiere's reception, Eastwood and Cardinal Winters were photographed in conversation, their heads bent toward each other in what appeared to be a deeply engaged discussion. The image appeared in newspapers worldwide, a visual echo of the connection Eastwood had described in his interview. Meanwhile, Pope Prevost's Bridges of Understanding film initiative gained significant momentum. Applications from filmmakers around the world poured in, many citing Eastwood's interview as their inspiration. The Pope expanded the program, adding a special category for student filmmakers exploring themes of dialogue across religious and cultural boundaries. In a sermon at St. Peter's Basilica a month after the interview, Pope Prevost referenced the power of storytelling without directly mentioning Eastwood. When we enter into another's story, even briefly, we begin to see through their eyes. This is the beginning of understanding, the seed from which peace can grow. Those familiar with Eastwood's comments immediately recognize the parallel to his description of film as creating space to see through eyes not our own. The subtle acknowledgement further cemented the unexpected bond between the two figures. Susan Bennett, the producer of the original interview, found herself nominated for a television award for the segment. "We couldn't have planned this," she told reporters. "It was one of those rare, authentic moments that reminds us why live television matters." Mr. Eastwood spoke from the heart, and it resonated in a way none of us anticipated. John Miller received hundreds of messages from viewers who had been touched by the interview. Many described how it had inspired them to reach out to estranged family members or friends with whom they had political or religious differences. "I moderated the conversation," John said during a podcast appearance. But the impact came from Mr. Eastwood's simple wisdom and honesty. He reminded us that respecting someone's humanity doesn't require agreeing with their views. Patricia Clark, who had been in the studio audience, did indeed call her brother after 3 years of silence. Their first conversation was awkward, but opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. Something about seeing Clint Eastwood, this tough guy, from all those westerns, talk so respectfully about finding common ground just hit me differently, she explained to her husband. If he can see value in perspectives different from his own, maybe I can too. 6 months after the interview, a special screening of Eastwood's film was held at the Vatican's newly renovated film center. Though Eastwood's health prevented him from traveling to Rome, he participated via video link, answering questions from an audience that included religious leaders, filmmakers, and diplomats. Pope Prevost made a brief appearance at the beginning of the event, his presence underscoring the significance of the cultural bridge that had been built. "Cinema at its best does not tell us what to think, but invites us to see differently," the Pope said in his opening remarks. "This is also the work of faith, to open our eyes to realities beyond our immediate understanding." Mary Rodriguez, a curator who organized an art exhibition inspired by the dialogue between Eastwood's cinematic philosophy and Prevost's theological vision, observed, "What's remarkable is how an unplanned moment on television created space for so many to reconsider rigid positions. It wasn't a formal peace negotiation or diplomatic summit, just an honest conversation that touched something true. The story might have faded from headlines after a few weeks, but its effects continued to ripple outward. Film schools added course modules examining the parallels between Eastwood's body of work and Pope Prevost's writings on dialogue. Interfaith organizations created discussion guides based on Eastwood's films, using them as starting points for conversations about moral complexity and understanding across differences. 1 year after the interview, Eastwood was asked about it during a rare public appearance at a film retrospective honoring his career. "Did you have any idea the impact your comments about Pope Prevost would have?" a moderator asked. Eastwood shook his head, a slight smile crossing his face. "Not at all. I just answered the questions honestly." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But that's how the most important connections often happen, isn't it? Not through grand plans or strategies, but through simple moments of genuine exchange." The audience nodded, many remembering exactly where they had been when they watched or heard about that unexpected interview. What had begun as a standard promotional appearance had evolved into something much more significant, a testament to the power of authentic conversation to bridge the most unlikely divides. In both Hollywood and the Vatican, two worlds often seen as representing opposing values, the story of Clint Eastwood's surprising comments about Pope Robert Prevost became something of a parable, a reminder that meaningful connections can emerge from the most unexpected places if we remain open to genuine dialogue.